Thank you very much, Karin. And thank you very much to everyone here at Sardes who gave the very kind invitation for me to come here today and to see Utrecht for the first time. But I've been familiar with the work of Sardes, just had a very close relationship with the Harvard Graduate School of Education for at least the past 7 or 8 years. So it's wonderful to see you in your home rather than at the School of Education at Harvard. And to thank the Vversterk project. We'll keep trying. So I'm going to talk today about this issue of placing early childhood development within a much larger context of the post-2015 Global Development Goals. Or if we were to think about where early childhood development sits within a larger effort of UN member nations around issues of learning. Where is it that we would say that a comprehensive and integrated approach to early childhood development sits? And as much as I'm going to give you information, I would like to request some input and information from you. As this report that Karim mentioned is now open for public comment until October 18th. And we are trying to get as broad input as possible from the global early childhood development community across rich, middle, and low-income nations. So as you read, please write down your comments, and then I'll give you an email at the end of the presentation to send in your comments. And they can literally be about the wording of particular phrases, as I'll tell you. There's been a lot of discussion about particular wording of the goals, targets, and indicators that are being proposed by our group, which I'm going to tell you about first, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, but are also engaged in a process which for the next year and a half or so will be in a global process of member nations of the United Nations coming together and debating what should be the goals that set the agenda for the next 15 years, from 2015 to 2030. Our group has proposed 10 goals with 3 targets each, and I'll go into more detail and show you what those goals are. But the goal that we're really most concerned about here today, and that really I think animates our work lives and our commitment to the field of early childhood development, is a focus on learning and how we sustain and facilitate learning across generations for the future of our societies. I'll talk a little bit about the costs of business as usual in ECD and indicate just how high the costs are if we simply continue on the course that we've been going on from 2000 to 2015. How many, for example, hundreds of millions of children will not reach their developmental potential if we proceed on the course of business as usual. I'll present to you the proposed target and indicators on early childhood development that are in our report, and then I'll request your feedback. So the context of this, of course, is one question we might ask is how are these next 15 years going to be different from the last 15 years? We've had a set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, that apply to the period of 2000 to 2015. There's been quite a lot of progress. For example, rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality have declined greatly across the globe. In the meantime, the scientific evidence on climate change and resources and biodiversity in the world has shown that we are on an extremely dangerous course. And so the urgency of sustainable environmental development is going to be very much more prominent in this next set of goals. This seems clear from statements of the Secretary General, but also, I think, many advocacy groups till now. So this means that the field of education and the field of early childhood development is now within a broader frame of the urgency of sustainable development. And that's, of course, because we have tremendous issues around multiple planetary boundaries being breached at the moment. In far too many contexts, biodiversity, for example, falling below levels of recovery. issues of renewable and non-renewable resources, issues of climate change, and the actual fragile boundary around our Earth being breached in multiple ways through carbon emissions and other factors. So these are things that perhaps we don't think about as much in early childhood development, but I think this overarching goal means that we need to think a little bit about how our programs, our policies in early childhood can contribute. Because the fact is, no society will be able to make any progress on sustainable development without children. So children are really the most common basis for all forms of sustainable development. And that's really the thesis upon which our report on education and early childhood development rests. So another shift, and this is why I think many people in the global ECD community have really come around to pay very close attention to this post-2015 planning, is that a comprehensive approach to early childhood development was excluded from the Millennium Development Goals. And infant mortality and maternal mortality were the two indicators and goals that were prominent, that are relevant to early childhood development. But as one of my mentors, Robert Myers, who is a leading and senior figure in global ECD and low and middle income countries, observed in a classic book now that's about 30 years old, he called the book The 12 Who Survive. And at that point, 1 in 13 children worldwide did not make it to their 5th birthday, did not survive. But he asked the question, what about the 12 who do survive? And the thesis of the current report is that the children who survive actually have a right to thrive. All children have a right to survive, but all children also have a right to thrive and then have a chance to contribute to sustainable societies. And that means success across the life course, from birth into middle childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So we also know that in the Education for All goals, there has been an emphasis on early childhood care and education, but I'd like to point out that that emphasis never mentioned learning. So it was only about what we might call inputs into learning. And so there was of course it's important to expand and improve early childhood care and education, but that was actually not linked to the notion of learning or the notion of development or what we would like to see as the goal of ECD programs and policies. So that will be another feature of our proposed target and indicators. And as Karin mentioned, we have a very strong evidence base now that the foundations of brain architecture are laid down in the first years of life. That process is exquisitely sensitive to environmental influence. If children do not receive the right resources, nutrition, safety, nurturing care, responsive interactions with caregivers and with adults, there are lifelong consequences for health, learning, and behavior. We now are seeing how lifelong disease and earnings, economic factors, the ability to participate socially in society, all of these things are very powerfully influenced by the interaction of genes and environment in the early years. We're now even learning that genes themselves change, that they are turned on or off by what is precipitated in the environment. So what we used to think of as nature that was static is actually something that is influenced by environmental enrichment. And so the urgency of investing in early childhood development has been supported by this converging evidence from neuroscience, the biological sciences, developmental science, program and policy evaluations, and economics. And so we're at I think a very different place than we were 15 years ago in how we talk about the science of early childhood development. And in the full report, again, I request your feedback on the short summary of this evidence base. So what is this network? The Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It's chaired by Professor Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University in New York. And it is the network that puts research and technical expertise at its base to influence this process on the post-2015 goals, but also work on the solutions that will get us to progress on the post-2015 goals. So this network is meant to be sustained over the next 16 or 17 years. Someone at the leadership meeting 2 weeks ago said, oh, this is somewhat like the insects, cicadas, that stay in the ground for 17 years and then they come out every 17 years to go through this goals process, and then they go back underground. But so this network aims to stay above ground for the next 15 years and not just engage in the development of the goals and the definition of the goals, targets, and indicators, but also develop solutions that are sustainable for societies. And so at the same time that we're working on goals, we are thinking about, for example, capacity building initiatives to increase the professional development of leaders in global early childhood activities worldwide. So those are the kinds of solutions, technology-based solutions for education, for example. So the network has proposed 10 goals from a report that you can look at that was released in June 2013. We're hopeful about its influence because the Secretary General, in his report to the General Assembly, called A Life of Dignity for All, relied heavily on the first report from June. But that report only stated the initial set of goals and targets. It didn't present the rationale for them fully. And so there are groups for each of these goals. And the goals of each of these groups is to support the member nation process. There's quite a complicated process. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it involves different groups of nations working towards the post-2015 goals. And essentially, they're about to enter a period of negotiations starting in February to decide what the content and the wording and the actual indicators that would be the ways that nations measure progress towards these goals will consist of. The other aspect of this network is to create a set of regional universities around the world that are committed to working on sustainable development, from issues of extreme poverty, environmental development. Our third goal is the one on effective learning for all children and youth, and that's the one I'll talk about the most. But this is just to give you a sense of what some of the other goals are: to achieve gender equality, social inclusion, and the rights of all humans, a goal focused on health and well-being, a goal focused on agriculture systems and food security, and other ones that are about sustainable cities, about extractable resources, about climate change, and on governance. So we have a variety of these goals, but it is clear from the initial set of conversations that, as with the Millennium Development Goals, health and education will be quite central to the notion of global development. So the group that I co-chair has an interesting title. It's called Early Childhood Development, Education, and the Transition to Work. And so that's very hard to remember, or it's certainly a mouthful. What I take away from it is a positive aspect of it, that we need all these words to indicate that learning starts at birth and goes into adulthood. And so I actually think that's a very positive way to think about the integration of early childhood into life course development. And that is because early childhood development, we could say, is the culmination of learning for one generation embodied in the beginning of learning for the next generation. So it has a multi-generational aspect to it. It is what brings together adult development back into the very beginning of life. And so this group has a scope where I think we want to emphasize that aspect of development. So we titled our report Lifelong Multi-Generational Learning for Sustainable Development. So instead of thinking about learning as, for example, reading and math scores on standardized tests in 3rd or 4th grade, as in many countries, we want to think about learning that spans the entire life course. And so there are recommendations about adult education, non-formal education, and also education that occurs outside of traditional school settings. And here again, I think early childhood development provides some guidance for example, primary and secondary education, because it's a field for a long time where we've realized that a tremendous amount of learning, for example, happens in the home. A huge amount of learning happens in communities. Learning happens in peer groups. It happens in informal gatherings in villages. It happens outside of the formal 4 walls of classrooms that we might think of as preschool education. It happens in the interaction between a community health worker and a parent with a newborn. So here I think early childhood development is a wonderful example of how in this group we talk about lifelong learning. And this concept of multi-generational learning we also wanted to highlight because, again, this is very central to early childhood development around the role of families, older siblings, and other adults in communities, villages, and neighborhoods. But perhaps it's not as much the norm to think about this in the context of primary, secondary, tertiary education, or higher education. So the structure of the Millennium Development Goals was to have 10 goals and then 3 targets for each of those goals, and then within those targets, indicators. And so indicators are literally, for the researchers among you, they're variables. They're things that are quantitative measures on which we can indicate progress. So the challenge for ECD was first to come up with a target that would fit within this goal of lifelong learning for all children and youth, and then to come up with indicators. Now the target for the criteria were the criteria for the target were first that it should be measurable in a large number of countries. Not just rich countries, but also low and middle income countries, ideally measurable even now. Relevant to all nations in the world. And this again is going to be a difference between the MDGs and this next set of sustainable development goals, which is that they need to be relevant to all countries in the world. And that means that the focus in the MDGs that was relatively more on extreme poverty reduction and the poor countries, it does need to be expanded. And that's why input from folks like you in a country as well off as the Netherlands is going to be very important because the agenda should be relevant to ECEC in the Netherlands. Finally, it has to be easy to understand and brief and not very convoluted, easy to pronounce, easy to understand. So before I go into the actual draft target and indicators, I wanted to very quickly go through what are the costs of business as usual, what is the current state of affairs in global early childhood development, and here I am going to focus on where the problems are the most acute, and that probably is the low and middle income countries. Many of you might know this figure. More than 200 million children in the world are at extreme risk for not reaching their developmental potential. And this is by virtue of either stunting or extreme poverty, which is the UN definition of absolute poverty, which is under $1.50 of household income a day. So this is impossible to look at, but it breaks out the numbers by region, and the proportions are astonishingly high. So if you look, for example, at sub-Saharan Africa, the number of children, the percentage of children who are stunted is 37% by the age of 5. The percentage who are living in absolute poverty by the age of 5 is 46%, so roughly half of children in Africa under the age of 5 are at this level of extreme risk. And that percentage is also very high, about 52% in South Asia. It's the lowest in Central and Eastern Europe, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, where it's about 18 or 19%. But that's still 1 in 5 children living in those areas, and that includes Europe, at this level of extreme risk, stunting or extreme poverty. So why does stunting matter? And why does early childhood development matter? Is it that children become stunted at any point in their development? For example, at age 7 or 8? No, here the evidence is that the first 2 years are very critical. And so this is a study from 54 low and middle income countries in the journal Pediatrics around the worldwide timing of when children start falling behind, and falling behind meaning the World Health Organization definition of 2 standard deviations below the mean in terms of their weight for height, for example. And so we see that this happens critically by the time of the red line, which is 1,000 days after birth. And so the first 2 years are extremely critical for this issue of growth. The proper kind of breastfeeding, followed by complementary feeding and nutritional supplementation. Plus, of course, immunizations, micronutrients, and prevention of the critical issues of diarrheal disease, access to clean water. All of those things are involved in these numbers, which are really quite tragic in the sense that after age 2, it's very difficult to recover. Children are not recovering from stunting after age of 2. Why does stunting matter? Stunting is associated with cognitive and schooling deficits that are quite large in terms of the effects. If these were effects of interventions, they're all going in the wrong direction, but they are quite large effects, and they are resulting from even moderate stunting, not extreme stunting. What are some of the other conditions that we need to be worried about? We need to be worried about the contexts in which children live. Many young children in far too many countries are left alone for a large portion of the day. In much of the developed world, we might think of this as an after-school issue. In much of the developing world, we have to worry about this at any time during the day because of the work schedules of low-wage workers in developing countries, the amount of travel they have to do to their jobs, and then the conditions and the unsafe conditions that children under 5 are being left in many countries. And this shows the disparities between the percentage of children left alone between the richest 20% in each country and the lowest 20%, and much higher rates in the poorest 20%. The bottom here goes from 0 to 70%. So in some countries, far over half of the poorest kids are being left alone for significant portions of the day. Another issue we have to think about is violence. And if we think about sustainable societies and the ways that early childhood development can prevent conflict over the long run in adulthood, is there a role that ECD can play in the reduction of violence, both in households and in communities and ultimately in societies? And here, this evidence from the UNICEF MIX, which is the multiple indicators cluster survey. UNICEF has done a wonderful job putting together household surveys, and now they are collecting them in over 80 different countries. And in one of the last waves of the mix, they asked a question about the proportion of primarily physical punishment that parents are providing. And in far too many of the countries where the mix gathered data, the proportion of physical punishment to non-physical or nurturing discipline is in the wrong direction, so that the primary form of parental discipline is actually harsh physical discipline, which we know also is one of the major factors in the development of aggressive and antisocial behavior across the lifespan. We also have to keep into account that children who start displaying aggression and antisocial behavior in early childhood are the most likely to show that in a very stable way, and to then ultimately show the most chronic and severe kinds of violence and aggression and antisocial behavior in adolescence and into adulthood. So here we see that in many, many of the countries, this is over 40 of the countries that were surveyed, the vast majority of discipline that's occurring is physical discipline. So we have a tremendous amount to do to change societal norms, to engage in violence prevention programs, to work with fathers and with mothers, to engage all members of the family in reduction of violence in the home and violence against children. Finally, these maps, I think, are very stark and show the nature of pre-primary enrollment worldwide. And we have had tremendous progress in both rich countries and in middle-income countries in the past 20 years to increase the rates of pre-primary enrollment. And my favorite comparison here is between the United States and Mexico, where one might expect the United States, with its greater levels of resources, might have achieved higher levels of pre-primary enrollment. Well, it's not true. In the United States, about 70% of 4-year-olds are enrolled in preschool for their 4-year-old year. And in Mexico, that's been 100% since 2005, because in 2002, they passed a national law to provide universal preschool for all children. They are, in fact, one of the only countries in the world to actually make that enrollment mandatory as well. Though it's not quite clear what the punishment is if you don't put your kid in preschool. Those kids are still allowed to go to school, for example. But you see the colors here, the darker colors are higher rates of enrollment, so that the darkest red is really above 90% enrollment. The yellow is less than 50%, and we see a huge and striking difference between the global north and the global south. The most striking figure, if we look at the progress since the Education for All goals started in 1990, so we've had 20 years, is that despite the progress in middle-income countries and rich countries, there's been almost no progress in low-income countries. And so in low-income countries, pre-primary enrollment was 11% in 1990, and now it's only gone up 4 percentage points to 15%. So we have a tremendous issue here as far as a form of education that we know can have tremendous learning benefits, economic benefits for children. We also know, of course, that preschool enrollment varies by household wealth and income. And in every region of the world, children in the top income quintile, the top 20% of income, are far more likely to be enrolled in preschool at the age of 4 than those in the lowest 20%. So we have a lot to do to address these disparities. The only region where that's not true is South Asia, and that's because of the huge spread of the huge coverage of the ICDS program in India, which is the Integrated Child Development Services program, which, by the way, has a lot of quality issues. As much as the programs we're familiar with in the rich countries have quality issues, that's also true in large-scale programs in other countries. So that's the kind of depressing picture. What is the promising picture? From everything we understand, the economic arguments will continue to be very strong to place ECD at the table, to put ECD on the agenda for the post-2015 goals. And so we all need to be aware of these numbers to be able to argue to our representatives, including the Netherlands representative, including the UK representative, everybody who will be engaged in this conversation globally among the UN member nations. Jerry Behrman and Sergio Ursua, who are leading economists of early childhood development, contributed to the landmark Lancet report in 2011 by Pat Engel. And they estimated that in the low and middle income countries, to raise preschool enrollment to just 50% in all of these countries would provide benefits of over $33 billion US dollars and a benefit cost ratio of between 8 to 18, depending on how economists calculate what's known as the discount rate. So tremendous economic benefits. A parenting program, turning from, that's for preschool enrollment, but turning to kind of infants and toddlers, a parenting program, this has been a model for programs worldwide that add to the emphasis on breastfeeding, supplementary feeding, complementary feeding and nutritional supplementation, and emphasis on cognitive stimulation and responsiveness for learning. So adding education to health, essentially, for 0 to 2-year-olds, a program in Jamaica that was implemented 20 years ago. In a randomized experiment, they have now followed up these kids 20 years later. The participants have higher levels of IQ. They have reduced anxiety, depression, and violent behavior. They have 50% higher earnings. So this is a very recent study by Paul Gertler and Jim Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. So this will be a study that we need to talk about as much as we talk about the preschool program. Very similar research design, very impressive effects, and the power of parenting-directed interventions for kids at severe risk, in this case, risk for stunting. So what's our target? And I do welcome feedback on this. Every word of this has been reviewed by quite a lot of people, but more people need to look at this if we are to kind of come together around it. Our proposed target for early childhood development is to ensure that all children under 5 reach their developmental potential through increased access to quality early childhood development programs and policies. What I'd like with this question of, well, what's developmental potential? We are defining it as across domains, physical, cognitive, social, and emotional aspects of children's development, which means that it would be expected that countries develop measures in each of these domains for children under the age of 5. And I would note here that we have an emphasis on universality. Rather than reducing the number of those 200 million at extreme risk, we wanted to also provide a goal that was relevant to the rich countries, to OECD countries. And here it is about universality, that we want all children to reach their developmental potential. Now, in every country, the definition of developmental potential might be a little bit different, but it needs to cover physical, cognitive, social, and emotional development. So the indicators also have to be measurable. They need to be supported in the evidence. They need to cover the multiple sectors of ECD programming, which include health, education, and social protection or poverty reduction. They should pay attention to marginalized populations. And they should emerge from the consensus of the global ECD community. And so this is what we attempted to do in this set of indicators. I'm going to take you quickly through them just to show you the range that is represented in the idea of coordinated, integrated, and comprehensive ECD programs and policies from birth to 5. So first, we have 3 that are very critical early indicators of health and nutrition. The proportion of children with preterm births, low birth weight, and stunted growth. The indicator for stunted growth is actually by age 2, based on that evidence I showed in the graph. The proportion of kids with access to comprehensive nutrition, family planning, and healthcare from preconception to age 5. The proportion of families with this combination, like the Jamaican program, of an emphasis on parenting and learning, combined with breastfeeding and nutrition, especially for infants and toddlers. So that's really directly from the current evidence base. So you see there's a very strong emphasis in health, of course, integrated with learning in the first 3 indicators. The 4th indicator is about poverty reduction, and it is access for those who are living under the national poverty line in every country to adequate social protection. And these can include, often in the rich countries, this is something like a paid leave policy that is generous and adequate and provides flexibility for things like childcare. In many other countries, these might be things like cash transfers. They might be conditional on things that are good for kids, like immunization. The conditional cash transfer based on preschool enrollment is a new idea that I think will be important over the next 15 years. And childcare provision for those places where childcare is very expensive, which is in very many countries. So support for childcare, which can often eat up as much as half of your household budget in terms of earnings. The rate of developmental delays and kids with special needs being an aspect that countries should pay attention to. And in far too many countries, this is not assessed or tracked in any way from birth to 5. The proportion of children in a quality primary education program, I think we'll hear much more about this during the rest of the day. Something about public financing. And so the percentage of annual spending on education that's devoted to the pre-primary years. And right now, UNESCO has just raised their suggested proportion to 10% from 7% for pre-primary education, indicating that this is really an area of underinvestment despite the economic benefits of investing in quality preschool. And then a indicator that really tracks the necessity to think about the early primary grades, kindergarten through third grade in many countries, by talking about basic competencies, again, across physical, cognitive, social, and emotional development by age 8. And so this kind of link upward, we're hopeful that a holistic approach to early childhood development might influence and really reform the directions for school improvement in the first years of primary school. So those are the indicators, but we have in the report some directions for governance and implementation. There's been a tremendous amount of activity worldwide around national action planning in early childhood development. Just among the low and middle income countries, at least 40 to 50 countries in the past decade have put together national action plans. They typically cross the ministries of health and social protection and education, ministries of women's affairs. But the key of integration and coordination has been very difficult to achieve, both horizontally, if we think about across ministries, but also vertically, which means from the national level down to subnational, say, state or province or district levels, and the local level. And the question of how we create these governance structures is quite difficult. We talk about government and civil society coalitions, which have been very key in many low and middle income countries and rich countries alike in advancing ECD. The very important principle of local participation and community participation, not just in kind of giving their opinion of the quality of services, but in actual participation in budgeting and planning of ECD, so that there is local governance capacity building in this sector. And finally, the critical issues of leadership development at the national and subnational and local levels. I think I'm running short of time, so I'm going to go probably skip over this issue of measurement because I think quite a few of the other presentations are going to talk about the critical issues of measures. But we do talk about these in the report at both the child level and at the level of settings and the quality of the context that they're in, whether they're in home-based programs or community-based programs or center-based preschool. We think there are implications for the OECD in terms of expanding learning in this vision to socio-emotional, in particular, issues of self-regulation and executive function. We're still learning just how to measure these in many other countries. And to take the 3 pillars of sustainable development, which Ban Ki-moon has defined as being from a Rio summit last year, to be economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. I think there's a powerful case we can already make for ECD contributing to economic development and social inclusion. We need to also really strengthen ECD's contributions to environmental sustainability, teaching children about their habitat, about the earth, about the limited resources, and also making sure that our ECD structures, the infrastructure, and the programs themselves are sustainable. So I'd like to close with a request, again, to send any suggestions that you have to this email, info@unsdsn.org, and we're gathering comments until October 18th, and me and my research assistants will be gathering all the ones on ECD, and I'll be busy at the end of October with these revisions. But look forward to keeping you updated on this whole process, and thanks so much for your attention.